16 and Away from Home by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 13. Mrs. Owens Has Her Say. March 5th, 1890. I wrote to Ma about my problems with Clarice. She says I must continue to pray for her and treat her as a friend. But how do you be a friend to someone who stabs you in the back? I'm glad both Ma and Pa are praying for me. I rolled over in bed and looked at the sunshine coming in the window. It was going to be a beautiful spring day. I just love Saturdays, I said to Sarah Jane. We can sleep in.
Oh, so why don't you?
She mumbled into her pillow. It's almost 8 o'clock, I replied. I can hear Jacob getting water from the rain barrel for our hair, and I can smell Letty's good donuts. She sat up.
Now that you mention it, so can I.
We quickly dressed and stripped the bed. Letty would bring up clean sheets after breakfast. Sarah Jane paused to glance out the window.
I think it looks warm enough to dry our hair outside if we stay out of the wind and in the sun. Don't you think so?
I nodded. In fact, I may stay out in the sun all morning long. You'll have to bring me my dinner at noon. Letty laughed when we told her.
I'm afraid it's a bit early for that. It looks warm, but you'll find the air is pretty cool. This is fickle weather. It may be snowing by tonight.
I started to protest till I thought of another spring day that had started out warm and balmy. Sarah Jane, do you remember the day we cut the legs off our long underwear and then got caught in a blizzard?
How could I forget it?
She replied.
Ma sewed mine back together, and I had to wear them like that until I outgrew them.
Are the boys coming over this evening? Letty asked as we dried our hair.
Yes, Sarah Jane answered. And Warren and Molly, too. Thomas has a new game he wants us to play. I'm certainly glad you straightened things out with Russ, she said to me. I thought for a while you weren't going to tell him that it wasn't your idea that he bring Clarice to the Valentine party.
I might not have, I said, but he asked me. I think he suspected it might have been all Clarice's doing. Jacob was sitting on the porch mending a chair. We heard him chuckle.
Things don't change much over the years. They tend to get older, Letty replied. What else did you have in mind? I was thinking of the Bradley boy and the Owens girl, he replied. When I remember what happened back when we were in school, it appears to me that the Valentine business may not have been all Clarice's idea. Now, Jacob, how you talk. Although you may be right, Gertrude hasn't changed a great deal. Did you go to school with Mrs. Owens?
Sarah Jane wanted to know.
Oh, yes, Jacob answered. And Russ Bradley's folks, too. Gertrude was determined to have Russ Bradley, but he chose Martha Russell instead. I don't think Gertrude ever got over it. Do you suppose Mrs. Owens is just as determined that Clarice will have Russ?
Sarah Jane wondered.
Wouldn't be surprised, Letty said. And Gertrude is a strong-willed woman.
Sarah Jane looked at me thoughtfully.
That explains some of it, Mabel. Clarice has been unhappy because you've been more popular than she has almost since school started. On top of that, she probably thinks Russ belongs to her by reason of inheritance, and you came in and took him away from her.
That's no answer, I protested. That's another complication. And even if it's true, what can I do about it? Parents don't choose husbands for their daughters anymore.
I wouldn't count on it, Jacob said dryly, especially when you consider who the parent is.
While we were getting ready for supper, I voiced my thoughts to Sarah Jane. You never know when you're bringing trouble on your head, do you? Here I thought Clarice was to blame, and I'm causing it myself by being friends with Russ. Sarah Jane stared at me in disbelief.
Mabel O'Dell, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard you say, and that's saying something. What could you do about it? Tell Russ, sorry, but I can't keep company with you because Mrs. Owens wants you to marry her daughter? He'd think you were out of your mind, and he'd be right. The Bible says, as much as lieth in you, keep peace with all men. Letting Clarice have Russ is something I could do, I replied. Now Sarah Jane was really annoyed. Who gave you the right to hand Russ around like a piece of pie? Did it ever occur to you that he may like you better than he does Clarice? I hadn't thought about that, I said meekly. Well, think about it, she snapped. If you try to run Russ's life by telling him he should pay attention to Clarice, you're as bad as Mrs. Owens is. I guess you're right,
I admitted.
Let's forget about Clarice and have fun this evening, Sarah Jane suggested. The others will be here right after supper.
The Parcheesi game Thomas brought was such fun that neither of us gave Clarice another thought. Letty brought us cookies and apples to eat.
Jacob and I have to go to town to pick up a few things, she told us. We'll be back in about a half an hour. If you want more to eat, you know where to find it.
Thanks, Letty, Sarah Jane said.
When you get back, you and Jacob should come and play with us.
That was the most fun I've had in a long time, I said as we were getting ready for bed. We need to do this more often. Letty was right about the spring weather not staying. There was snow on the ground when we awoke Sunday morning.
It may melt off before evening, Jacob predicted. This is good sugaring weather, snappy nights and sunny days. We'll be ready for church in just a few minutes, Letty said after breakfast. You'll need your scarves and gloves again.
We arrived at church early enough to greet Russ and Thomas before the service began.
How about going for a walk this afternoon? Thomas said. We can go right after dinner and be back in time for young people's meeting.
That'll be fun, Sarah Jane agreed. We'll see you then. The boys left to sit with their families, and Sarah Jane and I joined Jacob and Letty. From the pew where she sat with her parents, Clarice turned to look at us. I recognized the expression that meant there was nothing good in store for us. Now what? I whispered to Sarah Jane. Something tells me she's about to spring another trap. Sarah Jane nodded. Let's stay away from her. We followed Jacob and Letty out when church was over and arrived at the door in time to hear Mrs. Owens speaking to Reverend Charles. You know I don't like to carry tales or cause trouble, she said. I think you ought to know what is going on. After all, you are the shepherd of this flock.
Yes, Mrs. Owens, Reverend Charles sighed. What is it?
It has come to my attention, Mrs. Owens replied with evident satisfaction, that some of the young people of this congregation are spending their evenings together playing useless games. I think it is your duty, since one of the young persons is your own son, to stop this wasteful practice. We all know that activities which do not benefit the soul can be tools of the devil. Of course, recreation once in a while is not at all bad, but this could become a habit. She waited a moment to see how this piece of news would affect the minister. Since he said nothing, she went on. I also know for a fact that while this game playing was going on, those same young people were left alone and unchaperoned in the house. She looked around at us triumphantly. I'm sure you see where your Christian responsibility lies, Reverend Charles. I certainly would never allow my daughter's reputation to be sullied by such associations. Now, understand, I'm not blaming your son as much as I do certain first-year students. She glared in our direction again. I've done what I felt I should do as a Christian. Now it's up to you to take action. Mrs. Owens descended the stairs with the feathers on her hat bobbing indignantly, the very picture of righteousness on the march. Clarice sidled past with a parting remark. You're in trouble now. To say that we were dumbfounded would be an understatement. I felt as though I were glued to the spot. Letty's cheeks were red, and Jacob's eyebrows came together over his eyes, but they both shook hands calmly with the minister. We followed them numbly to the buggy to go home.
That miserable old busybody has gone too far this time, Jacob muttered. I've a notion to go over there and give her a good tongue-lashing.
Least said, soonest mended, Letty reminded him. When you haven't done anything wrong, there's no need to defend yourself.
We weren't unchaperoned, cried Sarah Jane. You were both there with us.
We were gone for half an hour, Letty reminded her.
I suppose she or Clarice saw us in town. Reverend Charles is a sensible person and a man of God. I'm sure he'll take into consideration the source of the complaint.
We trusted Letty's judgment, but I was feeling worse by the moment.
Now there are 6 of us in trouble because Clarice hates me,
I said.
Where is it all going to stop? I'd almost rather just back off and let her have her own way.
Oh, no, you don't,
Sarah Jane declared.
You're not going to budge an inch. You said yourself that the Lord would fight our battles for us if we do what's right, and you've done what's right.
That's easy for you to say,
I retorted.
I think this whole business is going to make me old before my time.
Father said not to worry about Mrs. Owens, Thomas informed us as we headed back toward the woods on our walk. He'll tell her that he talked to me about it and it's taken care of. That's just one of the hazards of being a preacher's son. I looked at him in surprise.
Do you think you're the one Mrs. Owens has it in for?
Why, yes. Who else would it be? Don't you remember the fuss on Halloween night? I missed the whole party because she complained to Father. I think you're both taking Mrs. Owens' spitefulness too personally, Sarah Jane said. You have to give her credit for one thing. She treats everyone to the same ornery disposition. We decided that Sarah Jane was right and went on to talk about other things. But when I prayed that night, I didn't ask the Lord to bless Clarice. Neither did I ask him to get rid of her exactly, although I suggested that some distance between us wouldn't hurt my feelings. As I was drifting off to sleep, I remembered Ma saying that we shouldn't expect the Lord to nag our enemies for us. All he knows how to do is love them. End of chapter 13.